Chapter 48 Meeting with James. Deborah hung up with Travis, feeling like she was walking on air. The biggest obstacle in the way of her and Travis moving to Jacksonville was her father-in-law. Now, with that situation almost resolved, the only thing left was to tell James. In truth, the situation with James was as difficult for her to do as it was for Travis to tell his father, but in Deborah's case, her job had become much less a major obstacle after what she made for her work as DC Consulting. Now the problem involved the possibility of letting James down and leaving Prentice and Van Meyer without an assistant counsel, the place where she had been given not one, but 2 opportunities of a lifetime. She had been agonizing over the best time to break the news to him ever since she'd returned from Jacksonville, and it seemed like there was never going to be a good time to bring it up. Now, feeling relieved that the situation with Paul was resolved, she took advantage of her mood, using it as an opportunity to finally tell James. She walked to his office door and found it open. She peeked her head in and saw him at his desk, head down, going over papers. "Hey, James," she said cheerfully. He looked up from his work and smiled. "Hey, you! Come on in. I know I haven't had much time lately to talk. How have you been, Deborah?" He put his pen down and sat back in his chair. It was an unspoken invitation for her to come in and talk. He knew that if it were anything work-related, she would take the invitation. If it were something else, she wouldn't even notice. "Everything is going well. I wonder when would be a good time for us to talk?" she asked. "I'm a little pressed right now trying to prepare these briefs for court. How about later this afternoon? Let's say in about an hour," he replied. "An hour would be perfect. It'll give me time to finish up what I have pending as well. See you soon," she answered. She had been waiting for the right time to bring up wanting to leave the firm, but he had been expecting it to happen since the day she told him over the phone how much she and Carol earned from their work as DC Consulting. He had seen too many instances before where that amount of money changed people's lives, almost always in ways that they never expected. He had already rehearsed what he would say when the conversation came up, so he returned to his work, preparing the briefs for court in the morning. When she came back to his office, he had already been done with the briefs for 20 minutes. He took the rest of the time to pull her file and had it ready when she came into the office. "Is this a good time?" Deborah asked. "Perfect timing, as usual. Come on in. What is it you want to talk with me about? Before you answer that, how's Travis?" "Travis is fine. You remember Paul, his father? Well, he is taking an extended cruise." "That's great news." "That night was great. I saw an uptight man loosen up before my very eyes, and I felt so happy for him, seeing his father basically coming back to life. It was a night I will never forget." By now she had come in, closed the door, and had taken a seat. "Yes, it was. He has not been the same since. In fact, he's selling the house that Travis was raised in. Can you believe it? He's moving on to bigger, better things," Deborah said. "He is not alone, I suspect," Travis added. "Oh, no, he hasn't found anyone, not yet. But Travis and I are hopeful that he will. 3 months is a long time." "That's not what I meant, Deborah." "Oh, Isn't that what you want to talk about? You leaving the firm?" Travis asked. She felt a sudden chill run through her body, and she paused, looking at James. He was smiling, and didn't seem at all upset. "You knew?" she asked, surprised. "Of course I knew. I knew the moment you told me how much you and Carol made when you were still in Jacksonville. I was surprised you even came back to Philly, and I was even more surprised when you didn't say anything that night at dinner." "Why didn't you say anything?" Deborah asked accusingly. "Do you have any idea what I have been going through, Feeling guilty about leaving? She added. What you have been going through? What about what you put me through? Imagine what it's like having a millionaire working for you. You can't tell them to do nothing, worried about them walking out on you, or else you're waiting for the day when they tell you to take this job and shove it. He stopped talking and looked at her. The blank expression on her face told him that she wasn't getting it. He burst into laughter. He knew it would surprise her, and he wanted to put her fears to rest. Talking about what you've been going through. Give me a break. What about me? Travis said through his laughter. Now she caught on and started laughing too. They shared a moment laughing together, and then, as it started dying down, he held up her file. I already talked to Dieter, and he agreed, he said, lying. Then he took out the contract that she signed when she accepted the assistant counsel position. He picked up a red marker and crossed out the paragraph stipulating that she would not work as a paralegal or assistant counsel for any other firm other than Prentice and Van Meyer. He put down the marker and picked up a pen. He signed and dated the change on the contract, then handed it to Deborah. Just put your initials and date next to mine, and we won't hold you to your agreement not to work for any other firm. He turned the contract around so she could see where to put her initials. After she did, she sat back in her seat and exhaled loudly. Finally relieved from the anxiety that haunted her for weeks. I don't plan on working as... I know, Deborah. I don't imagine you plan on working anywhere. Then they both started laughing again. He knew that she could have left at any time, and respected her because it took weeks for her to build up the courage to break the news to him and to the firm. You never said. What are your plans? Are you and Travis going away with Paul? No, we're going to Jacksonville. No, really, James, I have to be with my family. Suddenly it all made sense. He'd learned about her past growing up in an orphanage by way of her testimony in church and her connection with Denise. Then he saw her relationship develop with Carol, and then finding her son in Florida. If that wasn't reason enough to leave, then I don't know what is, he thought. How soon are you leaving the firm? Travis questioned. I'm not sure just now. There's so much to do. Travis still has to put in for a transfer, but if you need another assistant counsel, I can step aside immediately. I'm sure Dieter is interested in finding a replacement as soon as possible, but there is no sense in asking you to leave any sooner than we have to. But if you ever change your mind in the future, we have given you an excellent evaluation, and you can count on the highest recommendation from this firm. Thank you, James. You don't know how much this means to me, Deborah said. Well, you can show me come Christmas time, he said jokingly. Then they both started laughing again. She left the office. He took her file and thumbed through a few pages. He pulled out a blank evaluation form and filled it out. Then he typed and printed out a recommendation and signed it Dieter Van Meyer. He placed it into a folder and put it back into the file cabinet. I'll cross that bridge when and if it ever comes up, he thought to himself, more happy for Deborah than he was worried about being discovered. Chapter 49. The Robinson Community Outreach Center. In the weeks that followed after Carol completed her training, she became more valuable to the firm than anyone could have expected. The thing most evident was her influence on the office, resulting in a change in the turnover rate of the lawyers on staff at the firm. With so much to do, the duties of the lawyers on staff, while in between court cases, changed from having to bring in revenue to updating and performing the maintenance on the numerous businesses included in the Robinson account. They were assigned accounts with no prior legal representation, so modifying the business structures increased its value in almost every instance by half, and in others by as much as 75%. Carol proved uniquely qualified in providing paralegal support to their many questions, some that even included providing insight into the idiosyncrasies of the member client. The camaraderie and morale in the office increased, and for the first time since the Bradley firm opened its doors, its lawyers began to enjoy coming to work. Albert first began to recognize the change of having Carol in the office one afternoon as he was leaving to go home. In the past, he had always been the last car to leave the parking lot, with the occasional exception being Margaret. At first, he noticed 2 cars still there when he was leaving. The next week, the 2 cars became 3, then 6, and now the parking lot was practically full. They were still there working when they could have gone home. In truth, he had only agreed to hire Carol as a favor to James, with the sole intention of having a favor owed him, should he ever need to call on him for some unforeseen reason in the future. Then, after finding out that she was a member of the Robinson family, his reason changed, because of the opportunity it created to land a Robinson business account. Now he was finding that hiring her was a boon to the operation of his business. The atmosphere in the office was now one of unity instead of the dog-eat-dog, survival of the fittest atmosphere that he had purposely fostered between the lawyers. As he sat in his car looking at the almost full parking lot, he began to think of a way that he could show appreciation for what she had done. Albert being Albert, though, it didn't take long for his thoughts about what he could do for Carol to change into what he could do for himself, and the cars still in the parking lot became his reason for thinking that he should expand his firm and hire more lawyers. Then his guys wouldn't have to work so many hours, he thought, convincing himself that what he came up with was for their own good. Then he started up his car and drove away, his thoughts having just as quickly turned to what club he was going to visit in a few hours. While Albert was sitting in the parking lot, Carol was inside on the phone with Greta. "Things are fine, Greta, and I'm finished with training now. I have been for a few weeks, but I wanted to get into the routine of working here before I went back to attending meetings, and that's why I'm calling. I'm ready to start attending meetings again." "So you want to make the next one tonight? I can pick you up at the shelter and we can talk," Greta asked, obviously excited to hear from Carol again. "I'm not at the shelter anymore, but we can meet at the diner and have a bite to eat before we go to the meeting, okay?" Carol replied. "You sure you don't need me to come and get you?" Greta probed. "No, I have a car now," Carol said. "Well then, I'm on my way and I'll see you when you get there," Greta responded. As they met in the parking lot of the diner they first went to, when Carol first arrived in Jacksonville, the 2 women embraced, genuinely happy to see one another again. "When did you get your car?" Greta asked. "A few weeks ago, and there's so much more I want to tell you," Carol answered. They sat together in the diner, with Carol filling Greta in on the events of the past few weeks. When she got to the part about the money that she and Deborah made from DC Consulting, she paused and told Greta to ready herself. Even though she was told to, Greta wasn't ready for what she heard and screamed. The other patrons in the diner startled and stared at the 2. Carol did her best to calm Greta down, but it was no use. "You hit the jackpot!" Greta exclaimed. "Hush, girl! You know what kind of tip these people are going to be looking for if you don't hush," Carol said, joking. "And that's the car you bought?" Greta said, confused. "What's wrong with you, girl? You should have had a—" "That's what I want to talk to you about, Greta," Carol said, interrupting her. Greta stopped talking now, trying to understand what Carol meant. "I got that car because I want to open an outreach center, and I don't want the residents to feel like I ain't one of them," Carol said. "Outreach center? How soon are you wanting to do that?" Greta asked. "Well, in a way, that depends on you, Greta. I want you to run it for me." "You want me to what?" Greta asked, shocked. "Girl, you know how these places operate as well as anybody, and I know I can trust you. I'm still going to be working full-time at the firm during the day, and I want you to handle the day-to-day operation and manage the center when I'm not there. Basically, I want you to run the place. Do you think you can handle it? I think I can do it, Carol, but it's going to take some time to learn it and even longer to get good at it. But I'm sure there are some classes somewhere I can take to learn about what I have to do. That's exactly why I want it to be you, Greta. You keep your feet on the ground all the time and don't let things get control of you. You were the first one telling me I should take the paralegal position when all I wanted to do was try to save the world. If you hadn't gotten in touch with Aunt Thelma, none of these things might have happened for me. And you are the best sponsor anybody could have. And now, this way, everybody at the Outreach Center can benefit from your leadership. Say you'll do it, please. Of course I'll do it, Carol. I would love to. But look at the time. We got to get to the Rebos Hall. She looked and saw Greta was right. She and Greta got up and paid their bill and headed out to the door, not having any time to spare to make it to the meeting on time. As soon as they started driving, Carol called Greta's cell phone, and while they drove, they continued talking about plans for opening the Outreach Center. She asked if Greta had time during the day to find a place that they could use. Greta told her that she had a few places in mind and would check them out tomorrow. They continued talking until they neared the Rebos Hall. Then they hung up, parked, and made their way in with just a few minutes to spare. This was the first time that Greta had ever attended meeting with her mind not at all on what was being said. Instead, she was thinking about what it would be like to help some of these same people and be the host of meetings herself. Then she had the idea to ask the leaders at Rebos for any advice they might have about what to expect in creating an outreach center. She was so preoccupied with her thoughts that she started to take out a pad and pen to write down the idea she was having, when suddenly she remembered the protocol at meetings was to never write anything down. It was a way of ensuring that everyone's anonymity remained intact. Realizing that she had almost unwittingly broken this cardinal rule is what brought her back from imagining the future to refocus her attention on the here and now. She looked at Carol, a few chairs away, and noticed how calm she appeared, paying full attention to the speaker, reminding her again to just take one day at a time like recovery teaches you. Then she smiled, and she also started listening to what the speaker was sharing. It only took Greta a week to find the perfect location for the outreach center. Carol took care of the finances to rent the property and had contractors immediately go to work renovating the building to their needs. Greta used the time to prepare herself. She created a morning routine and studied whatever she could find to manage the facility. She learned all she could from the owners of Rebos. They showed her how to partner with the homeless shelter to make the outreach center eligible to receive reduced rates on its utilities and financial support from the state. It was when preparing forms for submission to the state agencies that Greta learned that they not only had to come up with an official name for the outreach center, but that they were going to need legal representation as well. After she told Carol what they had to do, Carol knew that she could count on the Bradley firm for their legal representation, so she didn't dwell any more on that. Instead, she wanted to focus on the things that she could handle herself. They settled on the Robinson Community Outreach Center. As the renovations to the interior of the center were completed, Carol asked Greta to begin furnishing it. At the first furniture store she went to, after telling the salesman what she needed and why, she was told about the city program that provided furniture for free to organizations like hers. She checked and found that when the local hospitals or clinics upgraded or changed out their waiting room furniture, the city stored the old furniture, which it then gave away to organizations like the Robinson Community Outreach Center. So setup and delivery of the furniture was included for free. When Carol got off work at the firm, She went directly over to the outreach center like she had been doing every day now. When she arrived, she saw the convoy of moving trucks leaving the parking lot. Excited to see what Greta came up with, she quickly hurried inside. She found that every room had been furnished. Desks, couches, shelves, and even computers had been delivered and installed. She stood amazed at what she was seeing. Then Greta saw her and came up wearing a smile. "So, what do you think?" Greta asked. "I can't believe it, Greta. You really outdid yourself," Carol replied, impressed. "And the best part is that it was all free," Greta added. "Free? Did you just say free?" Carol asked, astonished. "The city provided everything because we are a non-profit for the homeless. I wanted to surprise you. That's why I didn't call and tell you earlier," Greta said proudly. "Well, it worked perfectly, Greta. I am surprised and amazed. You are incredible." "Come on, let me show you our offices," Greta said. Then she and Carol began walking down the hallway. Chapter 50. Expanding Outlooks. In the 2 weeks that Carol and Greta spent setting up the Robinson Community Outreach Center, Albert was involved in his own research for expanding his firm. The week prior, he'd instructed his accountant to prepare a budget for his proposal. Now, with it completed, he had the parameters to determine what the square footage he would need and the size of staff. The question he now faced was location. He was wishfully thinking how great it would be to be near the courts downtown where the major league firms were, but all the time knowing that the real estate value there was so high, there was no way he had the money to do it. When Carol peeked her head into the open door of his office, asking if he had time to answer a brief question about representing her outreach center. "Sure, what is it?" he answered. She entered his office carrying an armful of files. He immediately noticed all the files she was carrying, recalling how impressed he was with her work at the firm and what a positive impact she had on the staff. So instead of listening while she asked her question, he came to the immediate conclusion that he would represent her outreach center. So no matter what the question was, he would handle it and would do it free of charge. He was so pleased with himself for coming up with the idea, he was only waiting for her to finish talking so he could surprise her with the news. As he waited, his thoughts drifted, and he remembered when he was sitting in his car, trying to think of what he could do to show her how much he appreciated her. He was lost in thought, pondering the moment, when suddenly he heard Carol loudly call his name. "Albert!" It snapped him out of his daydream. "You didn't hear a word I said, did you? What's on your mind? You look a million miles away. What's wrong?" Carol asked. No, everything is fine, Carol. But do you have time to sit? I want to talk to you," he said. She could see that Albert was preoccupied with something else, and she could also tell it wasn't business related. She was doing her best to leave work early that day so that she could return to the outreach center and work with Greta during the final stages of setting it up. So she really didn't have time today to help him with whatever it was that he wanted to ask her. "Albert, I have a lot of files to take care of today, and then I have to go to the center to help Greta. Can it wait?" she asked. "Oh, absolutely, Carol. Don't let me keep you." She left his office, and he thought for a few moments more, then came to a decision. He pressed his intercom. "Margaret, can you get me Carl Robinson's number?" "Sure thing, Mr. Bradley," Margaret answered cheerfully. Taking a break from planning his firm's expansion, he called Carl. It was still morning, and Carl was handling a meat delivery, teaching Gary and Tony how to do it when he got the call. When caller ID showed that it was Albert Bradley, he immediately assumed that something was wrong. Walking away from the loading dock, he left Gary and Tony, telling them to handle taking care of the delivery while he took his call. "Hello, this is Carl. What can I do for you?" "This is Albert Bradley, Mr. Robinson." I know who you are. How can I help you? I want to talk to you about Carol. Do you have a minute? Carl assumed from the way that he asked that Albert was going to fire Carol for some reason. Now is not really a good time. I'm tied up with the grocery delivery right now. Let me call you back. Then Carl hung up without waiting for a reply. Albert took the phone away from his ear and looked at it quizzically. What is it with these Robinsons today? He thought, having first been turned down by Carol, and now Carl. After just a few moments of trying to figure out what was going on, he again pressed the button on his intercom. Margaret, when Carl Robinson calls, put him through immediately, he said. Sure thing, Mr. Bradley. Immediately. After hanging up on Albert, Carl waited a few moments, expecting him to call back. When he didn't, he returned to the loading dock and found the delivery just finishing up, and he was just in time to sign the invoice. He taught Gary and Tony how to sign it as he did, and informed Ray, the delivery driver that had been delivering to the store for over 20 years, that sometime in the future, either Gary or Tony would be taking the delivery and were authorized to sign the invoice. Ray congratulated Gary and Tony, and then said goodbye to Carl, jumped back into his truck, and left. Carl immediately sought out Thelma and found her in the office. He told her about the call from Albert, sounding like he was firing Carol. Thelma sat back from the desk, her face showing disbelief. Are you sure, Carl? Maybe it was something to do with that outreach center she's been working on. Let me call her right now, Thelma said. Carl put the office phone nearer to her and took a seat on the corner of the desk. She put the phone on speaker and called Carol, who answered immediately, sounding happy. Hey, Aunt Thelma. I'm so happy to hear from you. It's been a while. How have you been? We doing fine here, child. I got Carl here with me, and we was just wondering, how are you doing? Tell Uncle Carl I said hi. I miss y'all. You're on speaker, child. Carl can hear you. Hey, Carol, sweetie, I can hear you. Is everything okay with you over there? Carl asked. Everything is fine, Uncle Carl. The outreach center is almost ready to open. Greta is amazing, she responded. Well, what's this I hear about you having problems with Albert? Carl asked, concerned. Problems with... I'm not having any problems with Albert. What do you mean? Carol asked, confused. Well, I just got a call from him, and he wanted to talk about you. What'd you do? Carl asked. Well, what did he say? Asked Carol, with just a hint of irritation in her voice. Well, now, I ain't give him a chance to say much because I want to hear it from you first, Carl said. Wait now, hold on. What do you mean you ain't give him a chance to speak? What did he say, Carl? Thelma asked. Carol remained silent to hear her uncle's response. Well, he called, and I was taking the meat delivery, and then he said he wanted to talk about Carol. What else could he be wanting to talk about unless he was firing her? Carl answered. Well, if you'd just listened to what he wanted to say, you would have known the answer to that question, you old fool, Thelma responded. On the other end, Carol started laughing. Thelma had forgotten she was still on speaker when she reacted to Carl's answer. I'm sorry, Uncle Carl. I didn't mean to laugh. I don't know what he called about, but Albert and I are doing fine, and nobody said anything about me getting fired, Carol said. Well, I told him I would call him back. You want me to do that, Carol? Carl asked. No, Uncle Carl. I'll talk to him later and find out what's going on. But I understand what you were doing, and it was very sweet, Uncle Carl. Thank you for having my back, Carol said. Carl looked at Thelma, pushing his shoulders back. Thank you, Carol, baby. I'm glad you see what I was trying to do, Carl said. We're sorry to bother you, Carol. I thought Carl knew what he was talking about, Thelma said apologetically. It's no problem, Aunt Thelma. I'm glad to hear from y'all, Carol said. Okay, we're going to let you go now. Goodbye, baby. After she hung up the phone, she looked at Carl disapprovingly. You some kind of fool, Carl, Thelma said. I was looking out for her, that's all I was doing, and I ain't about to apologize for doing it either, Carl responded. He remembered that he still had the invoice, so he reached into his pocket and took out the crumpled piece of paper. What's that? Don't tell me that's the invoice, Carl. Don't tell me that's the invoice gobbled up like that, Thelma said. He put the paper down and turned, walking out of the office. Carl Robinson, you hear me talking to you, Thelma said. He kept walking to the office door without turning around. You just told me not to tell you that was the invoice, so I ain't say nothing, Carl answered. Carl opened the door and went out, pulling the door closed behind him. Disagreements between Carl and Thelma rarely happened anymore. Thelma continued looking at the closed door for a moment, then realizing that she had unintentionally upset her husband's pride, and that he was right after all. He was only trying to help Carol, and had no reason to apologize for that. She suddenly felt proud of her man, and more secure in her relationship with him, because the man she married was nobody's fool, and he did not back down to make her happy or anybody else when he knew that he was in the right. Then she looked down at the invoice on the desk. Old fool, she thought, picking up the paper and straightening it out before filing it away with the week's receipts. Carol had more cases to update in preparation for court the next day, and she worked through her lunch to get it finished. Above all else, she wanted to go join Greta at the outreach center as soon as she got off. She called Margaret, letting her know that she had time now if Mr. Bradley still wanted to talk. He cut in their intercom exchange, excitedly telling her that he was ready to see her, surprising her. Albert was hardly ever excited about anything. For a brief second she thought about what Uncle Carl said and wondered if she was getting fired after all. But the thought was only fleeting. She knew for certain that her position at the Bradley firm was secure. But the tone in Albert's voice had her curious now, so she hurried down the hall to his office. Margaret, gesturing as she passed, just go right in. Carol opened the door, and he immediately rose from the chair behind his desk, welcoming her, gesturing with his hand for her to come in. Please, have a seat, Carol. I have something to say, and I think you're going to want to hear it. She came in, curious, and sat across the desk from him. As she sat down, he sat back down. Carol, having you here has been one of the best things to happen to this firm since the doors opened. You have performed better than I ever expected, and don't get me wrong, I expected good things from you. Are you happy here? Albert asked. From that moment she and Deborah first met Albert, she felt suspicious about him. Then, when she heard him speak for the first time, everything about him screamed, I am a lawyer and an opportunist. Her reaction was to unknowingly pull her purse closer to her body, holding it tighter as she did. It was only later, after Aunt Thelma helped her to see that, despite how she felt about him personally, he was the best man to represent the interests of the Robinson family, because as a lawyer, he was supposed to be an opportunist, looking for loopholes anywhere he could find them in business matters. Then she reminded Carol, that's not the kind of thing you can turn on when you go to work and then turn off when you leave. After her talk with Aunt Thelma, she was able to stop negatively judging him for the flaws she saw in his personality and began to look upon them as a benefit because he was a lawyer through and through. Her performance at the firm, however, had nothing whatsoever to do with her feelings about him. In fact, it was because everyone else at the firm was nothing like him that Carol gave the job her best effort. But now, as she sat listening to him, there were two things different. First, it was the way that he'd spoken with excitement in his voice just a moment earlier. And second, the way his voice just shifted from excitement to concern that caused her to actually believe he was sincere about whatever it was that he wanted to tell her. So when she answered him, it was to put any doubts he had about her wanting to be there to rest. Albert, I've never had a job that I loved, not before coming to this firm. And I want to thank you for everything you do to make the Bradley Law Firm a reality, she said. The last part she came up with seconds before she said it, hoping to feed his ever-present ego, but was surprised when it went apparently unnoticed by him. Thank goodness, Carol. I am so happy to hear that. This place is so much different now. I would hate to lose you, Albert responded. Albert, you don't have to worry. I have no intention of leaving the firm to run the outreach center, Carol said reassuringly. What? No, I didn't think you wanted to. Carol, what I'm trying to say is that I am willing to have the Bradley Law Firm represent your outreach center on any and all legal matters, and I'm not accepting any money from you to do it. Not a penny. Never, Albert said. He paused, looking at her stunned look of surprise. And another thing, I've been looking into expanding this firm, in a large part thanks to you, though I won't go into that right now. But I want you to tell all of your family that after we move, every member of the Robinson family, and I mean every single member, business owner or not, will be entitled to legal representation from the Bradley Law Firm at no cost whatsoever. Ever. That's what I've been trying to tell you all day, Albert added. She was surprised and sat unmoving in her seat, a blank expression on her face. He waited, and then it was his turn to ask her. Carol, did you hear a word I said? He asked. Then she snapped out of it. Yes, I just can't believe it. I don't know what to say, Carol responded. Well, you start by telling your Uncle Carl and let him take it from there, Albert said. Now she understood what he was trying to tell Uncle Carl on the phone earlier, and she started laughing. He thought you were going to fire me, Carol said. What? That explains why he hung up on me. And here I've been waiting all day for him to return my call. Guess I would have been waiting longer than that, Albert said, surprised. Then he joined her laughing. Make sure you clear that up with him, okay, Carol? For my sake, Albert added. Now they both started laughing even harder. Outside the office, Margaret heard them laughing behind the closed door. It surprised her, because she had been working for Albert Bradley since day one, and not once had she ever heard laughter coming from that office. It made her feel good. Then she realized that she had been feeling good coming to work for so long now that she never even noticed when she stopped wondering if today was the day when it would end and things would change back to how they used to be in the office. And then she felt even better. Chapter 51. The New Albert's News. It was Monday morning, just 2 days after Carol told Denise about the opening of the Robinson Community Outreach Center, when Albert called her to his office. She took a seat and could see by the look on his face that what he had to say was not good news. He didn't waste any time and got straight to the point. Carol, I have to strongly recommend that you postpone the opening of the center. Your paperwork is a complete mess. You have no W-4s for anybody, no I-9s, no state withholding. You don't even have an employee identification form filled out for Greta. And these things take time, Carol. If you open those doors and Greta is there to help you, you'll be in violation of 10 state laws and statutes, Albert said. He was talking to Carol as if she were a misbehaving child, and she was seconds away from shutting him down from talking to her like that when he stopped and looked at her. The look he saw on her face said it all, and he immediately realized what he had done wrong. He quickly sat down and then moved forward to the edge of his chair, still looking at her. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was totally out of line. I didn't stop to think, Carol. I was just excited. Still doesn't make it right what I did, but I am truly sorry. You had room for one more word, just one syllable, Albert, and then the job be damned. I was going to come at you over this desk, boy. He burst into laughter, quickly followed by Carol. I believe you would, too, all 90 pounds of you. And I'd have been taking 90 pounds out your ASS, and you know I mean it. Again, they both laughed, and the atmosphere in the office returned to feeling good again. Margaret, at her desk outside, hearing the laughter from the office again, smiled and shook her head. This time it was Carol who started the conversation, knowing that he was not going to bring up the problems with the paperwork probably ever again. I really thought I would have time to do all those things after we got up and running, because it's a nonprofit. That's what I was thinking. But what can I do? We have to file these forms with the Social Security Administration, and that's what's going to take the most time. They have to set up your account. Now, I can pull some strings, so it should only take about a month if we're lucky. And there's some other things that have to be taken care of as well, but don't worry, Carol. I am personally going to get you on track, and you'll be open in a month from now. You have my word on it. Thank you, Mr. Bradley. I truly appreciate everything that you're doing. I really do. She stayed seated for a few minutes, while the fact that she was not going to be able to open the Robinson Community Outreach Center as soon as she'd hoped started to sink in. Then she got up to leave, with Albert calling after her, I got your back. On her way out the door, Carol asked herself, did this man just apologize to me? As she walked by Margaret at the reception desk. Hey, girl, Margaret said cheerfully. It surprised Carol and took her away from her thoughts about Albert. Hey, Carol responded. Then she walked up to Margaret's desk, leaned in closer, and asked her in a hushed tone, have you noticed something different about him? Gesturing in the direction of Albert's office with her thumb. Girl, it's like aliens done replaced him or something. But now, truth be told, it could be you, Margaret said. What do you mean, me? Margaret gave her a knowing look. It ain't even like that. Not at all. No, 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 Carol exclaimed, raising her voice. Margaret raised her finger to her lips, signaling for Carol to lower her volume. Carol looked around, making the oops face. Girl, I've been working here for 8 years now, and I ain't never heard no laughter coming out of that office. Not once. Not until y'all was in there together last Friday. And now, here again today. I'm just saying maybe he likes you, that's all. I see what you mean now, girl, but I sure hope you're wrong. Now it was Margaret's turn to lean forward. She confessed to Carol in an even quieter tone. I know, girl, but when I heard y'all laughing again, I started thinking about how, if y'all really did get together, it would be so good for him, because he does, and I mean he really does, need somebody. But then I was thinking, girl, don't do it, 'cause you certainly don't need him. I'm saying, girl, you know it, Carol responded, suddenly looking over her shoulder at the door to Albert's office after catching herself again. Carol leaned back in. He's a mess, she whispered, reaching out and giving Margaret a slow, quiet high five before she started walking away. Not long after Carol left the office, Albert received a call from his accountant telling him that his bid on the new office space had been accepted, and he was now able to start moving into the newly constructed office park whenever it was convenient for him to do so. He hung up, then sat back. The next second he jumped up out of his chair and let out a shout of joy. The intercom on his desk lit up. Is everything okay, Mr. Bradley? I'm great, Margaret. Everything is fine. Oh, and Margaret? Yes, Mr. Bradley? Pack your bags because we are moving, he said. Oh, it finally came through. That is great news, Mr. Bradley. How soon are we moving? Who do we have here right now? He asked. Well, everyone is here right now, Mr. Bradley. Have everyone meet in the conference room in 10 minutes so we can coordinate with everyone's schedule. To answer your question, Margaret, we're moving starting the first thing in the morning. I will let the movers know right away, sir. Thank you, Margaret. As the last person entered, Margaret used the intercom and let him know that they were ready for him in the conference room. He responded that he was on his way. When he entered the room, he was greeted by a round of applause. He was genuinely shocked and flattered by the applause because it had never happened before. He couldn't control the smile that appeared on his face, nor could he make it go away. He raised his hand to quiet the room and thanked everyone, grinning broadly. I appreciate your support, you guys and gals, but let's not forget who deserves it more than me. Carol, where are you? Would you please stand up? Looking out across the room, he saw Carol stand up from her seat near the back. If he had seen her before calling out her name, he would have seen the sadness in her face. She was feeling down, not only because the outreach center opening had been delayed, but because it was by her own doing. When she left Albert's office earlier that morning, she immediately began to think, recalling when Aunt Thelma told her how proud her parents would have been of her, and then how proud Denise was of her, and Carl, and Gary, and even James. She thought about Deborah, and finally Greta. She was feeling personally responsible for letting down all the people that believed in her, and that she cared about the most. The feeling of disappointment was just starting to overwhelm her when she heard Greta's voice from weeks ago cautioning her, "You know, it's been proven that the failure to accomplish goals has the tendency to cause addicts to relapse, taking drugs to feel better after they've failed." She began feeling herself coming back from the precipice of despair and getting control of her runaway thoughts when the meeting in the conference was called. Now, after being called upon to stand up and the room exploded with applause, the last vestiges of worthlessness that she was feeling vanished. The applause was so loud that even she was shocked and a little embarrassed, because it was just what she needed and just when she needed it to feel better about herself. The applause for Carol was so much louder than it was for him that Albert felt a surge of pride go through him, and he began to laugh out loud because of it. He felt the tingling of goosebumps all over his body because he knew, and now he could tell that everyone else did too, that Carol truly deserved it. Soon the applause died down, and he began explaining that the firm was moving to the new office starting tomorrow, and he wanted to know how it would impact their schedules. 3 of the lawyers had cases to try in the morning, and another one had a deposition to take. Everyone else, he explained, could collect their personal items tomorrow, but the others had to get their things before they left for the day. He ended the meeting by telling them to be ready for some new faces in the office. He was expanding the lawyer cadre by 10 more lawyers. This drew another round of applause from his staff. Lastly, he said that he would have preferred to have a celebration to commemorate the move, but it happened so quickly that he didn't have time. Everyone said it was okay with them and not a problem. Albert closed the meeting, and as he made his way out of the room, he stopped and checked in with Carol, asking if she was all right. "I'm fine now, Mr. Bradley. I appreciate you checking on me." Albert arrived at the realtor's and found the documents awaiting his signature. He signed them and then headed home to the bottle of champagne that he'd been saving for this very moment. Chapter 52. A momentary lapse of relapse. Greta was not someone who checked her mailbox on a daily basis. In the months following her retirement, it became something that she stopped having to do because of the significant drop in the amount of mail that she received every day. As if the world has forgotten me, now that I'm no longer a part of the workforce, she mused. Years later, she didn't bother to check her mailbox any more than once a week, at most. When Carol told her that she wanted her to manage the outreach center, Greta embraced her new responsibility with gusto. She quickly developed the daily routine of rising early, preparing herself to go to work, and checking her mailbox on her way in and out of her apartment. She would then stop off for a perfect cup of coffee from her favorite barista and a whole wheat muffin to eat while on her way to the center. She was responsible for setting up the outreach center and was eagerly looking forward to the grand opening. It made her feel like she was once again a part of the world that had seemingly forgotten her after she retired. Finding out a week ago that the center opening was to be delayed for a month really took a toll on her, disappointing her almost to the point of depression. The daily calls from Carol came to a stop after informing her of the delayed opening. Greta reacted by lashing out in her own way, refusing to keep to her new routine. She stopped going to her favorite barista for coffee and a muffin, and she stopped checking her mailbox. The only thing she did go back to was attending meetings at the Rebos Hall. She had stopped going during the time she spent overseeing the setup of the outreach center. Greta expected to see Carol at the meeting, having had no idea that Carol had also stopped attending. Greta had finished with her third meeting and still no Carol. She decided to call and talk her into making the next one. The call didn't even ring. It just went straight to voicemail. It was Carol's refusal to take her call that brought Greta's attention back to what she had overlooked. Carol must have taken the delayed opening as hard, if not harder, than she did. She started thinking that Carol might be on the road back to using again because of her disappointment. It surprised her because, as Carol's sponsor, she should have known better and seen it coming a week ago as soon as the daily calls stopped. But she too was coping with the disappointment that she felt at the time, and it was only her years of sobriety that prevented her from relapsing. But Carol only had months of sobriety under her belt, and the situation was a hard one for anybody to cope with, sober. With the meeting now over, she went outside to call Carol, but again the call went straight to voicemail. She then decided to go visit Carol at the Bradley firm. She knew that going to her job was a drastic step to take, and as she got in her car, she hesitated, thinking of the different reasons that could explain why Carol didn't answer her phone. Then she imagined seeing Carol high after relapsing, and suddenly going to see her at her job was worth the risk. It was still morning, so she had to be there. The worst she can do is refuse to see me. At least then I'll know one way or the other if she's on the road to using again, Greta reasoned, turning the ignition to start the car, then backing out of the parking space. Where before she had been indecisive and hesitant to go so far as to show up at Carol's job, she was now determined and started driving with a purpose. She drove, weaving her way through the morning traffic on her way to the Bradley firm, when she had the idea to call Thelma, who might have some answers to her questions that could prevent her from having to go to Carol's job. She pulled out of traffic and into the parking lot of a furniture store where she parked. She took out her phone and called Thelma's number. After many rings, she impatiently hung up. Then she called again, and Thelma answered on the first ring. "Mrs. Robinson, I'm so sorry to bother you. This is Greta, Carol's friend." "Now you know I know who you are, child. You don't have to be so formal with me. You call me Thelma. And I'm glad you called. I want to talk with you about Carol. You heard from her?" This was the last thing that Greta wanted to hear, and before she answered, she closed her eyes and threw her head back. She was Carol's sponsor, so it was her responsibility, more than anyone else's, to look out for her and keep her from going back to using. She put the phone into her lap, trying to overcome the terrible sinking feeling that she was already too late. After a brief pause, she composed herself, and then she put the phone back to her ear. "No, ma'am, I haven't heard from her since last week," Greta answered. They talked for a few more minutes, and when they finished, she got back on the road, driving to meet with Thelma at the mansion. Thelma was home when Greta called, because it was Carl's turn to go into the store that day. They had been alternating going in after Gary and Tony started training for assistant manager. Ever since that day of their spat, Thelma had made it a point to patch things up with Carl. That day after they came home, she gave him a back rub and ran his bath. He was suspicious at first, but she made it clear. "You out here taking care of everybody else? Well, you need somebody who has your back too, Carl Robinson," she told him. Now that he understood, later on, he let his wife know how much he appreciated what she was doing. Now, whenever he came home, she took care of him the same way she did before. And every time, he demonstrated his appreciation the same way in return. Soon, she started to notice a big difference in his energy and especially his stamina. She was finally able to figure out that it was only his working every other day that created benefits she never even imagined. She was sleeping later than usual when Greta called, Carl's newfound stamina having finally gotten the better of her. It was the phone ringing for so long that woke her up before she finally got out of bed. Greta arrived, and because this was the second time they met with Carol's well-being as a topic, Thelma wanted her to know how much she appreciated her looking out for Carol. She'd arranged for her housekeeping staff to prepare a full banquet for lunch out near the pool, where they could enjoy a long, leisurely lunch and not have to be disturbed or rushed while discussing what they thought was happening with Carol. As they began their conversation, the first thing that became clear was that Carol was not speaking with either one of them as regularly as she had been doing. Like Greta, Thelma had not heard from Carol since she called last week to tell her about the delay in the outreach center opening. As Greta began telling her why she was so worried about Carol, explaining about the dangers that recovering addicts can have with disappointments, Thelma became worried because she knew firsthand what a disappointment this was for Carol. She explained to Greta that she and Carol had spent 2 days in a row planning the grand opening ceremony, with Carol coming over to the house after leaving straight from work, and ended up spending the night at the mansion both times after they worked into the early morning hours. Then she told her how she'd almost spent an hour on the phone with her the last day that she called because she could hear how sad Carol was. She even volunteered to go and stay with her, but Carol declined, saying that she was going to be fine. Now she was convinced that Carol was not going to be fine. After hearing about the dangers of relapsing because of the disappointment that Carol was facing, she suddenly got up from the table, abruptly ending the conversation with Greta, saying that she was on her way to see Carol at work. It took all that Greta could do to stop her, finally warning her of the damage that might be done if she accuses Carol of relapsing when she had not. All the trust and love that they have built up might instantly disappear, Greta warned. Then Thelma stopped, because she could see how easily what Greta described could happen, and if that did happen, she knew how difficult it would be able to put it behind them. She slowly came back and sat down. Well, what can we do? We have to do something, Thelma said, exasperated. First, we have to talk to her. That much is clear. But do we do it together? Do you think Carol would suspect that it's some kind of intervention? Greta asked. Only if she's using again, Thelma said quietly. Greta paused as she thought about her answer. That is very true. Very, very true. Both women then fell quiet, lost in their thoughts and fears about what might have already happened with Carol. Well, first thing, I'm going to call down there to that firm and talk to her, Thelma exclaimed. Thelma reached for the phone and made the call. Yes, may I speak with Carol Robinson, please? Oh, she's not? Well, okay then. Thank you. Yes, my name is Thelma Robinson. I'm her aunt. Could you just have her to... Well, okay, yes, I can hold. She put her hand over the mouthpiece and whispered to Greta. She ain't come in today, but they putting me through to Mr. Bradley. Greta shook her head, acknowledging that she understood. Then Thelma began speaking. Yes, this is Thelma Robinson. Yes, it's nice to talk to you too. Oh, so it was you who met Carl? Yes, that's right. Oh, no, it's nothing like that. We just wanted to talk to her, that's all. Yes, I'm here with her friend Greta, and we just... Yes, that's her, Greta Schmidt. Okay, hold on 1 minute. She took the phone from her ear and handed it to Greta. He want to talk to you. Greta hesitantly reached for the phone, looking at Thelma bewildered. Yes, hello. This is Greta Schmidt. She tried her best to sound businesslike and official, but she was unable to conceal her confusion. She sat quiet, listening, while looking at Thelma. Yes, I don't know if you know this, but the opening has been delayed, so... Yes, I can come in and sign them. Do I need... Okay, then. Then she handed the phone back to Thelma. I think he wants us to go down there, Greta said. Thelma took the receiver. Yes, this is Thelma. Well, I can't say, but I will check with her to make sure. As she was talking, Greta began rapidly shaking her head in agreement. No, I don't think that would be a problem. Okay, we'll see you shortly. Okay, then. Thank you. Goodbye. Thelma hung up the phone and looked at Greta. First, they say Carol ain't come in today, but then they put me through to the owner? Child, what have we gotten ourselves into? I feel like we in trouble or something, Thelma said. I know, right? Greta added. Then both women chuckled. Thelma called Carl before they left to let him know where she was going to be. He told her that the directions to the Bradley firm was still in the GPS from when he went there before. She thanked him and said she would call him back and tell him how things went. After she hung up, they started to leave. Greta was heading for the front door, and Thelma was heading for the garage. Both women stopped and looked at one another. We can take my car. It's right out front, Greta said. I thank you, but I need a car for grown folk, honey, Thelma answered. Miss Robinson, with all due respect, ma'am, I know you are older than me and wiser too, but I am closing in on 53 years old. Now, I'd say that makes me grown, so my car must be too, Greta said matter-of-factly. See, now, that's just the kind of confusion that keeps folks at odds with one another. In the first place, I don't know what you heard, but I ain't that much older than you. And in the second place, I ain't talking about grown as in age, child. I'm talking about grown. Thelma stood facing Greta, seductively running both hands down the sides of her body. You get what I mean, honey? Thelma asked. Yes, ma'am, I do, Greta said, chuckling. Good, 'cause I'm gonna need you to drive, 'cause Carl got the GPS set to get us there, but I ain't too good at following that thing, and I don't know the first thing about where we supposed to be going. Can you work that GPS thing? Yes, ma'am, Greta quickly responded. Greta followed Thelma through the living room to the garage. When she saw the Escalade, she got excited. Ooh, I always wanted to drive one of these, Greta said enthusiastically. Then it's good for both of us, Thelma added. As they left out of the garage and onto the long driveway, Greta marveled at the luxury of the vehicle. You sit so high up in here. I love it, Greta commented. Carl had to have this one too. It's the ESV model, Thelma said. When they arrived at their destination, they found an empty parking lot. Is this the right place? I followed the GPS. You heard it say we have arrived, but it doesn't look like anybody's here, Greta questioned. It sure don't do it, Thelma agreed. They looked around trying to see if maybe someone came out. Then, after they'd waited a few more moments, let me call that Mr. Bradley and see what's going on here, Thelma said. She took out her cell phone and called Albert. Oh, we moved last week, Mrs. Robinson. I'm sorry, I thought you knew. Let me tell you our new address. It's... Hold on, Mr. Bradley, hold on, Thelma said. Please, Mrs. Robinson, call me Albert. Okay, Albert. I want you to tell Greta where you are because she's the one driving, okay? Hold on 1 minute. Yes, ma'am, he responded. Greta started pushing buttons on the GPS as she took the phone from Thelma with her other hand. Okay, what's the address? Greta asked. While she listened, Greta continued pushing buttons on the GPS. Okay, the GPS says we should be there in 5 minutes. Does that sound right? Okay, good. I'm handing the phone back to Mrs. Robinson now. She passed the phone and started the engine. Okay, Albert. We'll be seeing you shortly. Bye now, Thelma said. Greta began driving and pulled out of the parking lot. I hope that Carol is okay. I wonder where she is. Let me try her number. Thelma dialed the number and put it on speaker. The call went straight to voicemail. They exchanged worried glances and remained quiet for the rest of the ride. Chapter 52. A momentary lapse of relapse. Greta was not someone who checked her mailbox on a daily basis. In the months following her retirement, it became something that she stopped having to do because of the significant drop in the amount of mail that she received every day. As if the world has forgotten me, now that I'm no longer a part of the workforce, she mused. Years later, she didn't bother to check her mailbox any more than once a week, at most. When Carol told her that she wanted her to manage the outreach center, Greta embraced her new responsibility with gusto. She quickly developed the daily routine of rising early, preparing herself to go to work, and checking her mailbox on her way in and out of her apartment. She would then stop off for a perfect cup of coffee from her favorite barista and a whole wheat muffin to eat while on her way to the center. She was responsible for setting up the outreach center and was eagerly looking forward to the grand opening. It made her feel like she was once again a part of the world that had seemingly forgotten her after she retired. Finding out a week ago that the center opening was to be delayed for a month really took a toll on her, disappointing her almost to the point of depression. The daily calls from Carol came to a stop after informing her of the delayed opening. Greta reacted by lashing out in her own way, refusing to keep to her new routine. She stopped going to her favorite barista for coffee and a muffin, and she stopped checking her mailbox. The only thing she did go back to was attending meetings at the Rebos Hall. She had stopped going during the time she spent overseeing the setup of the outreach center. Greta expected to see Carol at the meeting, having had no idea that Carol had also stopped attending. Greta had finished with her third meeting and still no Carol. She decided to call and talk her into making the next one. The call didn't even ring. It just went straight to voicemail. It was Carol's refusal to take her call that brought Greta's attention back to what she had overlooked. Carol must have taken the delayed opening as hard, if not harder, than she did. She started thinking that Carol might be on the road back to using again because of her disappointment. It surprised her because, as Carol's sponsor, she should have known better and seen it coming a week ago as soon as the daily calls stopped. But she too was coping with the disappointment that she felt at the time, and it was only her years of sobriety that prevented her from relapsing. But Carol only had months of sobriety under her belt, and the situation was a hard one for anybody to cope with, sober. With the meeting now over, she went outside to call Carol, but again the call went straight to voicemail. She then decided to go visit Carol at the Bradley firm. She knew that going to her job was a drastic step to take, and as she got in her car, she hesitated, thinking of the different reasons that could explain why Carol didn't answer her phone. Then she imagined seeing Carol high after relapsing, and suddenly going to see her at her job was worth the risk. It was still morning, so she had to be there. The worst she can do is refuse to see me. At least then I'll know one way or the other if she's on the road to using again, Greta reasoned, turning the ignition to start the car, then backing out of the parking space. Where before she had been indecisive and hesitant to go so far as to show up at Carol's job, she was now determined and started driving with a purpose. She drove, weaving her way through the morning traffic, on her way to the Bradley firm, when she had the idea to call Thelma, who might have some answers to her questions that could prevent her from having to go to Carol's job. She pulled out of traffic and into the parking lot of a furniture store where she parked. She took out her phone and called Thelma's number. After many rings, she impatiently hung up. Then she called again, and Thelma answered on the first ring. "Mrs. Robinson, I'm so sorry to bother you. This is Greta, Carol's friend." "Now you know I know who you are, child. You don't have to be so formal with me. You call me Thelma, and I'm glad you called. I want to talk with you about Carol. You heard from her?" This was the last thing that Greta wanted to hear, and before she answered, she closed her eyes and threw her head back. She was Carol's sponsor, so it was her responsibility, more than anyone else's, to look out for her and keep her from going back to using. She put the phone into her lap, trying to overcome the terrible sinking feeling that she was already too late. After a brief pause, she composed herself, and then she put the phone back to her ear. "No, ma'am, I haven't heard from her since last week," Greta answered. They talked for a few more minutes, and when they finished, she got back on the road, driving to meet with Thelma at the mansion. Thelma was home when Greta called, because it was Carl's turn to go into the store that day. They had been alternating going in, after Gary and Tony started training for assistant manager. Ever since that day of their spat, Thelma had made it a point to patch things up with Carl. That day after they came home, she gave him a back rub and ran his bath. He was suspicious at first, but she made it clear. "You out here taking care of everybody else? Well, you need somebody who has your back too, Carl Robinson," she told him. Now that he understood, later on, he let his wife know how much he appreciated what she was doing. Now, whenever he came home, she took care of him the same way she did before. And every time, he demonstrated his appreciation the same way in return. Soon, she started to notice a big difference in his energy and especially his stamina. She was finally able to figure out that it was only his working every other day that created benefits she never even imagined. She was sleeping later than usual when Greta called, Carl's newfound stamina having finally gotten the better of her. It was the phone ringing for so long that woke her up before she finally got out of bed. Greta arrived, and because this was the second time they met with Carol's well-being as a topic, Thelma wanted her to know how much she appreciated her looking out for Carol. She'd arranged for her housekeeping staff to prepare a full banquet for lunch out near the pool, where they could enjoy a long, leisurely lunch and not have to be disturbed or rushed while discussing what they thought was happening with Carol. As they began their conversation, the first thing that became clear was that Carol was not speaking with either one of them as regularly as she had been doing. Like Greta, Thelma had not heard from Carol since she called last week to tell her about the delay in the outreach center opening. As Greta began telling her why she was so worried about Carol, explaining about the dangers that recovering addicts can have with disappointments, Thelma became worried because she knew firsthand what a disappointment this was for Carol. She explained to Greta that she and Carol had spent 2 days in a row planning the grand opening ceremony, with Carol coming over to the house after leaving straight from work, and ended up spending the night at the mansion both times after they worked into the early morning hours. Then she told her how she'd almost spent an hour on the phone with her the last day that she called because she could hear how sad Carol was. She even volunteered to go and stay with her, but Carol declined, saying that she was going to be fine. Now she was convinced that Carol was not going to be fine. After hearing about the dangers of relapsing because of the disappointment that Carol was facing, she suddenly got up from the table, abruptly ending the conversation with Greta, saying that she was on her way to see Carol at work. It took all that Greta could do to stop her, finally warning her of the damage that might be done if she accuses Carol of relapsing when she had not. All the trust and love that they have built up might instantly disappear, Greta warned. Then Thelma stopped because she could see how easily what Greta described could happen, and if that did happen, she knew how difficult it would be able to put it behind them. She slowly came back and sat down. "Well, what can we do? We have to do something," Thelma said, exasperated. "First, we have to talk to her. That much is clear. But do we do it together? Do you think Carol would suspect that it's some kind of intervention?" Greta asked. "Only if she's using again," Thelma said quietly. Greta paused as she thought about her answer. "That is very true. Very, very true." Both women then fell quiet, lost in their thoughts and fears about what might have already happened with Carol. "Well, first thing, I'm gonna call down there to that firm and talk to her," Thelma exclaimed. Thelma reached for the phone and made the call. "Yes, May I speak with Carol Robinson, please? Oh, she's not? Well, okay then. Thank you. Yes, yeah, my name is Thelma Robinson. I'm her aunt. Could you just have her to... Well, okay, yes, I can hold. She put her hand over the mouthpiece and whispered to Greta. She ain't come in today, but they putting me through to Mr. Bradley. Greta shook her head, acknowledging that she understood. Then Thelma began speaking. Yes, this is Thelma Robinson. Yes, it's nice to talk to you, too. Oh, so it was you who met Carl. Yes, that's right. Oh, no, it's nothing like that. We just wanted to talk to her, that's all. Yes, I'm here with her friend Greta, and we just... Yes, that's her, Greta Schmidt. Okay, hold on 1 minute. She took the phone from her ear and handed it to Greta. He want to talk to you. Greta hesitantly reached for the phone, looking at Thelma bewildered. Yes, hello. This is Greta Schmidt. She tried her best to sound businesslike and official, but she was unable to conceal her confusion. She sat quiet, listening, while looking at Thelma. Yes, I don't know if you know this, but the opening has been delayed, so... Yes, I can come in and sign them. Do I need... Okay, then. Then she handed the phone back to Thelma. I think he wants us to go down there, Greta said. Thelma took the receiver. Yes, this is Thelma. Well, I can't say, but I will check with her to make sure. As she was talking, Greta began rapidly shaking her head in agreement. No, I don't think that would be a problem. Okay, we'll see you shortly. Okay, then. Thank you. Goodbye. Thelma hung up the phone and looked at Greta. First they say Carol ain't come in today, but then they put me through to the owner? Child, what have we gotten ourselves into? I feel like we in trouble or something, Thelma said. I know, right? Greta added. Then both women chuckled. Thelma called Carl before they left to let him know where she was going to be. He told her that the directions to the Bradley firm was still in the GPS from when he went there before. She thanked him and said she would call him back and tell him how things went. After she hung up, they started to leave. Greta was heading for the front door, and Thelma was heading for the garage. Both women stopped and looked at one another. We can take my car. It's right out front, Greta said. I thank you, but I need a car for grown folk, honey, Thelma answered. Miss Robinson, with all due respect, ma'am, I know you are older than me and wiser too, but I am closing in on 53 years old. Now, I'd say that makes me grown, so my car must be too, Greta said matter-of-factly. See, now, that's just the kind of confusion that keeps folks at odds with one another. In the first place, I don't know what you heard, but I ain't that much older than you. And in the second place, I ain't talking about grown as in age, child. I'm talking about grown. Thelma stood facing Greta, seductively running both hands down the sides of her body. You get what I mean, honey? Thelma asked. Yes, ma'am, I do, Greta said, chuckling. Good, 'cause I'm gonna need you to drive, 'cause Carl got the GPS set to get us there, but I ain't too good at following that thing, and I don't know the first thing about where we supposed to be going. Can you work that GPS thing? Yes, ma'am, Greta quickly responded. Greta followed Thelma through the living room to the garage. When she saw the Escalade, she got excited. Ooh, I always wanted to drive one of these, Greta said enthusiastically. Then it's good for both of us, Thelma added. As they left out of the garage and onto the long driveway, Greta marveled at the luxury of the vehicle. You sit so high up in here. I love it, Greta commented. Carl had to have this one too. It's the ESV model, Thelma said. When they arrived at their destination, they found an empty parking lot. Is this the right place? I followed the GPS. You heard it say we have arrived, but it doesn't look like anybody's here, Greta questioned. It sure don't do it, Thelma agreed. They looked around trying to see if maybe someone came out. Then, after they waited a few more moments, let me call that Mr. Bradley and see what's going on here, Thelma said. She took out her cell phone and called Albert. Oh, we moved last week, Mrs. Robinson. I'm sorry, I thought you knew. Let me tell you our new address. It's... Hold on, Mr. Bradley, hold on, Thelma said. Please, Mrs. Robinson, call me Albert. Okay, Albert. I want you to tell Greta where you are because she's the one driving, okay? Hold on 1 minute. Yes, ma'am, he responded. Greta started pushing buttons on the GPS as she took the phone from Thelma with her other hand. Okay, what's the address? Greta asked. While she listened, Greta continued pushing buttons on the GPS. Okay, the GPS says we should be there in 5 minutes. Does that sound right? Okay, good. I'm handing the phone back to Mrs. Robinson now. She passed the phone and started the engine. Okay, Albert. We'll be seeing you shortly. Bye now, Thelma said. Greta began driving and pulled out of the parking lot. I hope that Carol is okay. I wonder where she is. Let me try her number. Thelma dialed the number and put it on speaker. The call went straight to voicemail. They exchanged worried glances and remained quiet for the rest of the ride. Chapter 53. Meeting with Albert. As Greta and Thelma entered the parking lot of the Bradley firm's new location, they saw that there were rows of office furniture and equipment being moved in through the rear of the first building. Men were busy carrying plants and chairs and desks inside, with a large amount of items still yet to be moved. Is that the place? Thelma asked. Greta knew it was a rhetorical question, but she answered anyway. What are we supposed to be here to do? Help move furniture? Because I didn't wear the right clothes, Greta asked sarcastically. Thelma wasn't expecting what she heard from Greta, and it made her erupt into uncontrollable laughter. As she tried to stop laughing, she began coughing, and Greta immediately stopped driving and handed her a napkin from the console dispenser. Thelma had tears in her eyes and took the napkin. Thank you, Thelma said. Struggling not to start laughing again, she dried her eyes and, after collecting herself, exhaled loudly. Whoo, child! Don't do that no more, girl. Your mouth is dangerous, Thelma added. That's what they all say, but here I am, still single, Greta said jokingly. Thelma started laughing again. This time she was joined by Greta. The two women remained inside the car for a few minutes more, laughing and becoming fast friends as they did. Greta parked and they got out, and Greta went to Thelma's side and took her by the arm as they walked across the parking lot. One of the men moving furniture called out to them, "Hello, ladies!" They both waved to the man as they crossed the lot. Thelma, who was taller than Greta by a foot, leaned closer to her. He looked like a strapping young man. You better go get him, Thelma encouraged Greta. She tugged on Thelma's arm. Please, I'm old enough to be his mother, Greta replied. That's just what they be liking these days, girl. You better strike while the iron is hard, Thelma said. It's the iron is hot, Miss Robinson. It's supposed to be strike while the iron is hot, Greta responded. Thelma didn't miss a beat. I said what I said, girl. Get it while it's hard. Both of them started laughing again. They were so loud that all of the workers stopped and looked at them. They entered the lobby still laughing and went up to the counter where Margaret sat. "Welcome, Mrs. Robinson, Miss Schmidt. Mr. Bradley is expecting you. Sorry for the condition of the office, but we're still moving in. My name is Margaret. I can certainly see where Carol gets her sense of humor from. Feel free to take a seat, but sit over there," she pointed, "away from where the guys are bringing the furniture in, and I will let Mr. Bradley know you're here." Coming from behind the counter, she began walking down the hallway, then stopped and turned back around. "Can I get you all something to drink? Coffee, water, anything?" Margaret asked. "A bottle of water for me, please," Thelma said. "And one for me too, please," Greta added. Margaret turned and started walking down the other hallway. "I'll be right back, ladies," Margaret said. "Thank you, Margaret," Thelma said. As soon as she left the reception area, Albert Bradley appeared at the entrance to the hallway on the other side of the lobby. "Ladies!" He was happy to see them both, albeit for different reasons, and he approached them with both arms wide open. He caught the briefest look of confusion on both of their faces and remembered that he had never actually met either one of them before. Then, just as quickly, he collected himself and addressed them formally. "Mrs. Robinson, so nice to finally meet you." She took his extended hand, he held hers up slightly, and bowed his head. Thelma was impressed and glanced over at Greta, wide-eyed and smiling. Then he went over to Greta. "Miss Schmidt, it's an honor." He took her hand and lightly kissed the back. Greta couldn't help it. She giggled. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Bradley," she said. He released her hand and took a step back. "I have heard so much about each of you from Carol, I feel like I already know you. Please call me Albert. If you will, please follow me, and we'll go to my office where we can talk." He turned and started walking back to the entrance of the hallway. As they started following him, Thelma leaned closer to Greta. "This one's mine. Yours is out in the parking lot." Greta, still giddy with excitement from Albert's introduction, laughed out loud, and then quickly silenced it. "Bless you," Albert said over his shoulder without turning around. Both Thelma and Greta were feeling silly, silently laughing, grabbing each other's arms behind his back as they followed him. He turned his head after hearing the sounds of shuffling behind him, and they both straightened up and started walking calmly. Looking at them, he smiled, and then turned around again as he neared the door to his office. Greta and Thelma returned to their silent laughter, playfully slapping at one another's arms behind his back. Once they took a seat in his office, the reason they came to see him brought their mood from playful back to serious. Just as he was about to speak, there was a light tap at the door. "Come on in, Margaret," he said. She opened the door, balancing a tray with 2 water bottles, 2 soda bottles, and 2 cups full of ice. She walked over and put the tray on the coffee table in front of the 2 seated women. "Just in case you might want a soda," Margaret said. "Thank you so much, Margaret. That was very thoughtful of you," Thelma said, pleasantly surprised. She beamed. Thelma was doing everything that she could to boost Margaret's value in Albert's eyes, and it was working like clockwork. Margaret turned to Albert. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Bradley?" she asked. No, thank you, Margaret. I think you covered everything." He was surprised at how proud he felt of the way Margaret treated his guests. Thelma and Greta opened up their water bottles, taking a good sip before they were ready to get to the matter at hand. He watched silently as both women picked up their bottles with the same hand, unscrewed the top, and opened the water bottles in sync, drinking the same amount of water, then put the tops on the bottles at the exact same time. He could see that it was purely coincidental, and he wanted to make a humorous remark about it, but then reconsidered. He was not going to allow himself to slip up again and forget to treat Mrs. Robinson with anything but the utmost professionalism. He came to stand in front of his desk. "Greta, I ask you to come in to sign some documents so that we can make your position at the Robinson Community Outreach Center a legal one. The sooner we can get this turned in, the sooner we can open the center, Albert said. He picked up a few papers and a pen from his desk. He walked over, put the papers on the table in front of her, then started thumbing through them. This one is to confirm your position as director of the center. Greta was instantly filled with pride. She kept control of herself, but inside, she was jumping for joy. Then she became the director as she took the papers being handed to her. Okay, if you don't mind, I'd like to look these over first, Greta said, taking out her glasses and squinting at the papers and rubbing her chin. Thelma stifled a snicker watching her. By all means, of course. Take all the time you need, Albert replied. Albert backed up to his desk. Well, why am I here, Mr. Albert? Thelma asked. When you called, I assumed it was because you wanted to talk about the Bradley firm representing your family. Isn't that why you called? I have the documents right here, he said. He turned around and picked up an accordion folder full of papers. Wait a minute, Albert. I don't have the slightest idea what you're talking about. We called you to talk about my niece Carol, Thelma said. Greta stopped reading and sat back from the papers. Her focus was now with Thelma and his answer. I'm not sure I understand, he said. Well, let me tell you then, Thelma quickly responded. She explained that she and Greta were concerned because after Carol told them that the center opening was going to be delayed, they hadn't heard anything else from her in more than a week, and they could not reach her by phone. When Thelma got to the part where she said they could not reach her by phone, Albert stopped her. Hold it. That might be my fault. All my fault, Albert confessed. How so? Thelma asked, curious. Chapter 54. A Solution to the Problem. When I moved into this new office, I realized I had enough office space to increase the number of lawyers working here. So I had to increase the amount of office staff as well. And your niece has done such an incredible job here that last week I had to send her to the University of Miami, where a professor friend of mine picked out 3 of his students to train as paralegals. They had to be willing to relocate back here to work, but what I didn't know was that they still had another week until the school session was over. So I asked Carol if she would stay down there to train them until school let out, and then they would all return here. That's why she hasn't been in the office since last week. She's down there. It's more than likely that her phone is out of the local service area, so the calls just go to voicemail. It was a last-minute thing, so I want to apologize for anything that may have happened because she didn't have time to tell anyone before she left. That's why it's all my fault. Thelma and Greta listened, both going from surprise, then to shock, and finally to relief. Mr. Albert, you done cleared up a lot of things, and I want to say thank you for that. You took a real load off our minds, Thelma said, relieved. Greta shook her head in agreement. But now, what was that you was talking about the Bradley firm doing for my family? Thelma asked curiously. Albert began to answer, but he didn't start off at the beginning, so Thelma cut him off. Now, Albert, I want to know everything. You don't just start off from the middle of a story. I would have thought as a lawyer you'd have known that much, she said. If it wasn't for Greta giggling, he would have taken what she said so much more seriously, thinking that he had jeopardized being the representative of the Robinson business account. Instead, he joined her in laughing. My bad, Mrs. Robinson, Albert said. Call me Thelma, Albert. My friends call me Thelma. Yes, ma'am, he answered. Then he caught himself, again, taking things too seriously. Yes, Thelma. He was still standing in front of his desk, but now that he no longer had to treat Thelma so formally, he went and took the chair next to where she sat on the couch. Then he began telling her the whole story behind the reason he chose to have the Bradley law firm represent all of the members of the Robinson family for free. As he spoke, Greta leaned forward and flipped through the papers that he had given her. She picked up the pen and signed one, then flipped a few more pages, and after signing again, she sat back and listened intently to what he was saying. After he finished explaining how he came to his decision, he sat back in his chair, waiting for Thelma to respond. But it was Greta who spoke, after a few moments of silence. Does Carol know? I mean, does she know how she has affected everyone in the office? I think so. I mean, how could she not know? Albert asked. There's something you gotta understand about Carol. Can we talk privately? Thelma asked. Albert became confused. Yes, of course we can, he said. Then he looked at Greta, expecting her to take the hint and get up and go. She didn't move. Greta, can I get you to wait outside for a moment? What? Oh, no, that's not what I meant. Greta, child, you stay right where you are. She is my sister from another mister, and we have no secrets. What I meant is, can what I say stay between us, Albert, and you not tell Carol? Thelma explained. Oh, okay. Now I see. Yes, of course. I'm so sorry, Greta. I thought... It's no problem, Mr. Bradley. Don't give it another moment's thought. Please, I understand, Greta said. Then Thelma began to explain. See, Carol been going through some big changes in her life recently, even bigger than coming to work here at your firm. She done got back together with her daughter, and then her family, and all in the few weeks before you met her. She a Robinson, true, but we ain't seen nor heard from her in 20 years. Greta want to know, does she know, 'cause Carol feel guilty about what she done with her life in the past. So, if you ain't tell her straight up, she ain't likely to think it was something that she done right, Thelma said. Greta nodded in agreement. We come here thinking that Carol done relapsed, so you can see we worried 'cause she's still in a dangerous time with coming off the drugs, Thelma added. He sat quietly listening, with a serious expression on his face. So that means that what I did, I mean for the family, really did nothing for Carol at all. Thelma was suddenly speechless and could only squeal in delight. Overjoyed, she started bouncing where she sat on the couch, patting his thigh as he sat in a chair near her, as if to say, "You got it!" Yes, that's it exactly, Greta exclaimed. Thelma and Greta were surprised that he understood so quickly, when they expected that, thinking he was doing such a great thing for the family, he wouldn't be able to see what they were trying to tell him about Carol. Truth be told, he was as proud of himself for quickly understanding it as they were. It was further testament to his having spent so much time in the atmosphere that Carol created in the office. Now that he was understanding the situation, he took it to the next logical conclusion. So, when Carol returns, there is still the possibility that she might relapse, he said. Thelma and Greta both solemnly shook their heads in agreement. That's what we've been trying to get at all along, Greta said. Now Albert, instead of feeling relieved to understand what was happening, only felt worried and concerned. What can we do? He asked. I'll tell you what we do. We get Carol with somebody she can connect with, Thelma said. I am her sponsor, but I am so much older than she is, it's not the same as having a good friend, Greta said. What Greta said caused Albert to remember back to when Carol first came in to train for the paralegal position. Deborah, he exclaimed. Then both Thelma and Greta sat dumbfounded. "That's right. Deborah," Greta added. "She loved her some Deborah, that's for sure." "Was Deborah that took care of her daughter when she wasn't around, and what got her to take up with being a paralegal in the first place," Thelma added. "I might be able to do something about getting Deborah to come back down here," Albert said. "Well, I know that before she left for Philly, she broke down crying in the car saying how she wanted to stay down here in Jacksonville with her family. Carol told me that herself," Thelma said. "We still have 2 days before Carol returns. Let me make some calls, and I will call you both to let you know what I come up with," Albert added. He started getting up from his chair. Greta also stood up, handing the papers to Albert. "Here are the documents, signed and ready to go, Mr. Bradley," Greta said. "Thank you, Greta. Please, call me Albert." After taking the papers, Greta turned and helped Thelma to her feet from the deeply cushioned couch, and both of them thanked Albert as he walked them to the door. "Just give me a day or so to see what I can do," Albert said. Then they left the office. Greta and Thelma said goodbye to Margaret as they passed, and on their way to the door, Thelma turned around. "That's some nice furniture y'all got out there. You might want to think about getting it inside before the rain gets here. Gonna be just before it get dark." Albert had already started back towards his office, then turned around when he heard Thelma start speaking. From where he was standing in the lobby, he couldn't see the whole sky, but what he could see outside was sunshine and clear blue skies, no clouds anywhere. "Yes, ma'am, I will get right on it," he replied. This time he remained where he was and watched Thelma and Greta cross the parking lot. Then he asked Margaret to call the temp agency and have them send over 10 more workers. He returned to his desk and began looking through his Rolodex. He had just located the card he was looking for when the intercom on his desk lit up. "Mr. Bradley, the temp agency is asking if we are having a problem with the workers they sent over." "Thank you, Margaret. Can you put the call through?" he asked. "Sure thing, Mr. Bradley." "This is Albert Bradley. With whom am I speaking?" "Great. No, Tom, your guys are doing a wonderful job. Due to time constraints." "That's fine. I understand." "Tom, yes, a separate bill is acceptable." "No, at this point, I'm going to need the work completed before this evening. I'd say it's about halfway done right now, but I need it completed before the rain sets in this evening." "Fine. Then just send as many as you think will be needed to get the job done." "That's right. I have it on good authority that it's supposed to start just before dark." "Well, then I guess you can say you heard it here first, Tom." "All right. I appreciate you, Tom. You have a good day as well." He disconnected the call, then pulled out the card from the Rolodex and started dialing the number. Chapter 55. When Albert Met James. "Hi, Phyllis. Albert Bradley. How are you?" "Yes, it has been some time, hasn't it? It's good to hear your voice again, too." "No, still single, still here in Jacksonville. I started a firm." "Oh, you heard." "Yes, I've kept tabs on you, too." "I know, Madam Attorney General." "You must be very proud." "That's why I was calling. I just expanded my firm and was wondering—" Their conversation continued for another hour. When he finished and hung up, Albert pressed the intercom. "Margaret, can you come in here for a minute?" "Sure thing, Mr. Bradley." When she came into the office, she found Albert hurriedly collecting the many papers strewn across his large desk, unceremoniously cramming them into the briefcase sitting open on top of his desk. "Something pressing has come up, and I'm going to have to leave town for a few days. Will you be able to handle setting up the office while I'm gone?" "Of course, Mr. Bradley. The extra workers arrived a half an hour ago, and everything is in the building. They are busy setting up the offices right now. Shall I arrange your flight?" she asked. "Yes, Margaret, please. I'm going to Philadelphia. Arrange for an open-end round-trip ticket. If I'm not back in 2 days, have Carol familiarize the new paralegals with the law library, and just delay the official reopening until I get back. And feel free to forward incoming calls to your number, and work from home until I return." "Yes, sir, Mr. Bradley." "Will that be all, sir?" "Yes and no, Margaret. You have been with me from the beginning, and in addition to our new office, many things are going to change around here when I return. You are an invaluable part of this firm, Margaret, and I couldn't have done any of this without your keen insight and watchful eye. So look for a change when you see your next paycheck, and just know that it is only a fraction of what you are really worth to me and to this firm. Thank you for your years of support, Margaret." "Thank you so much, Mr. Albert. Working for you these past 8 years has been wonderful, and I am lucky to have you for a boss. Now, let me go arrange the flight, and what about accommodations in Philly? You didn't mention anything about it, shall I?" "No, Margaret, that has already been taken care of, but thank you." "Sure thing, Mr. Bradley. I will have your departure time in just a minute." He had an hour before his flight was scheduled to leave, and went back home to pack a small bag. He was just leaving from the parking garage of his condo when the rain started. He was making a left-hand turn as it did, and before he finished the turn, the intermittent droplets suddenly became a torrential downpour. He turned on the windshield wipers and then the radio. The sound of a weather bulletin alert immediately filled the car, a robotic-sounding voice warning that the unpredicted thunderstorm was expected to roll through the Jacksonville metropolitan area over the next half hour. Albert smiled and continued on his way to the airport. When he arrived in Philadelphia, he was met by Phyllis Stewart. Phyllis and Albert shared a history together that began after they met in law school. They'd earned the humorous distinction as the couple most likely to first have a child by their classmates during their first year. Their unabashed, fiery passion for one another was on constant display. Eventually, they found their passion had become a hindrance to their academics, and with grades failing below levels that neither was willing to accept, they agreed to see other people. They would, from time to time throughout their remaining years at law school, find time to reconnect with one another, curious to find out whether the spark between them still remained. They always found it burning hot as ever. Nearing the end of their last year in high school, she shared with him the news of her engagement to a mutual classmate, a member of a prominent family in the Philadelphia legal community. With his sincerest blessings and well wishes, after graduating, she went on to marry him, then moved to Philadelphia. In the years following law school, they kept in occasional contact with one another, mostly Phyllis reaching out to him by phone on the rare occasions when she and her husband were at odds. And when he first learned of her nomination for state's attorney general. Months later, he learned that she'd won her bid to become Pennsylvania's first black and first female attorney general. He sent a case of champagne to congratulate her. Afterwards, all actual communication between them, for obvious reasons, came to a halt. Aside from receiving a thank you card in the mail for his gift, it had been 5 years since they had last had contact with one another, before he called her earlier that afternoon. It had been 9 years since they last saw one another in person. Now, as they met at the airport, because of the intensity of their embrace, it was instantly clear that time had done little to extinguish the spark between them. Many hours later, as they sat together drinking wine in her hotel room, they discussed what he needed for her to do to help with the expansion of his firm. Albert called just before he thought James would be leaving the office. James sounded surprised and excited to hear that he was in town. "How long are you in town for?" James asked. "I'm just here for the day. I had to take care of some business. I'm leaving in the morning, but since I was in the neighborhood, I thought I'd drop a line and see if you want to get together and have a drink," Albert said. "That's a great idea and perfect timing. I'm just leaving the office. Where are you? I'll come pick you up." "I'm just finishing up here at City Hall. If it's too far, I can take a cab and meet you." "No need for that. City Hall is just down the avenue from me. I can be there in 2 minutes." They had only spoken to one another on the phone, neither having had the time nor the opportunity to actually meet in person before. "That sounds good. I'll be the one wearing a burgundy double-breasted suit," Albert said. "I'm on my way." James saw him waiting near the entrance to the municipal building and tapped his horn as he pulled up. Albert waved in acknowledgement and approached the car. After he got in, the two greeted one another, reciting the fraternity motto, while simultaneously performing their customary secret handshake. "It's good to finally meet you, brother. You like jazz?" James asked. "Is fat meat greasy?" Albert responded. "I know just the spot, and the waitresses there are ooh." As James pulled out into traffic, Albert looked around at the city. "So how are things coming along with the Robinson account?" "Oh, things are going very well, better than I ever expected. And I have had to move into a bigger office. And I'm taking on 10 more lawyers," Albert proudly declared. "Really? That's great news, Albert," James said, impressed. "That's what I want to talk to you about, James," Albert said. He stopped talking, hoping that James's curiosity would have him thinking that he wanted to recruit him. But James was preoccupied, navigating through the heavy evening traffic. He didn't respond. I see you're busy with traffic. I know how that can be. We'll talk more at the lounge," Albert added. "What? Okay. Well, we should be there in a few minutes. It really is great that everything is working out," James said, preoccupied. They had been relaxing to both the smooth taste of their cognac and the music from the live jazz band that had been playing from the moment they got to the lounge. They talked about their careers as lawyers and the cases they'd represented over the years that stood out. "What do you see in your future as an attorney?" Albert asked. "I used to see myself becoming a judge in the past, and working at Prentice and Van Meyer has been good for me in that respect. But now, with Van Meyer retiring next year, he's tapped me to take over running the firm. So running the firm or being a judge, one is guaranteed, the other is just wishful thinking. And I'm supposed to keep it quiet, so that stays between us," James said. Albert's response to James's good news was a casual, "Uh-huh," as he took a sip of cognac. James was offended by this lackadaisical reaction from his frat brother, but kept his feelings to himself. Maybe it's just his way, he thought. He kept looking at Albert as he slowly and purposefully placed his snifter back on the coaster, still looking intently at the glass. "I can get you that judgeship," Albert said flatly. James's mood was already soured by the perceived condescension that he felt from Albert, so his reflexive immediate response to what Albert just said was full of contempt. "What the hell are you talking about?" James barked. Albert slowly shifted his gaze from the glass to James. "I'm telling you that if you still want to sit on that bench, I can arrange it for you. In fact, I already have," Albert said flatly. James sat back from the table, his eyes narrowing. He then turned around, looking across the lounge for the waitress. Raising his hand to get her attention, as she started approaching the table, he stood up, preparing to leave. "I ain't got time for games. Find your own way back to your hotel," James responded angrily. "I came here to meet with Phyllis Stewart." We have a history that goes back to our first year in law school, Albert said. James turned back around and looked at him directly when he heard the name of the famed Attorney General. He slowly sat back down. "What are you saying? Spit it out," James ordered. The waitress approached their table, and Albert motioned for her to bring 2 more drinks. Then he explained to James about Carol and the events that led up to why he was interested in bringing Deborah to his firm. He knew that James cared about Carol, and how valuable Deborah was to him and to the firm. The only way he could see him agreeing to let go of Deborah would be if he no longer worked at Prentice and Van Meyer. James listened to the whole story, and when Albert finished, he sat back, quiet. "If you agree, then all I have to do is text Phyllis. Then she will call you," Albert said, breaking the silence. "You are something else, brother. Of course I agree," James exclaimed. Albert took out his phone and sent the text. Within a minute, James's phone rang. After a brief conversation, he hung up. James looked at him, shaking his phone, and then looked at Albert. "My man, I can't tell you how much this means to me. But I have to tell you, Deborah put in her notice 2 days ago. She is already leaving the firm and planning to move back to Jacksonville as soon as her husband's transfer goes through." "He works for the post office, you know," James said, still excited after his call. "What? She what?" Albert exclaimed. Albert was kicking himself, realizing now that everything he had done was unnecessary. If only I'd listened when Thelma told me that Deborah wanted to move back to Jacksonville, none of this would have happened. But then again, he thought, I did get to see Phyllis again, and my frat brother is a judge. James's mood had gone from upset to ecstatic in the blink of an eye. He hoisted his glass and was joined by Albert, who was now feeling proud of himself. "I appreciate everything that you've done, Albert. Believe me, I really do. But here's to Carol and to Deborah," James said. "And here's to the newest member of the judiciary in Philly," Albert happily added.